Hello chess fans, this video is extremely exciting. We are going to have a look at a game between Hikaru Nakamura and Alireza Firouzja played in round 12 of the FIDE Candidates. Only 3 more rounds to go and Hikaru Nakamura is only half a point behind the leader Jan Nepomniachtchi. Jan Nepomniachtchi had in the previous round a miraculous escape, turning around a lost position into a winning one against Indian Grandmaster FIDE. But 3 more rounds to go. Hikaru Nakamura doesn't care about what Jan Nepomniachtchi is doing. He is focusing on himself. He managed to win his previous 2 games. Very impressive way. And now he's playing in round 12 against Alireza Firouzja, who is a superstar, but it's not his tournament. He's really suffering. And at some point he even said that he wanted to quit. I mean, he was probably exaggerating a bit, very disappointed with the way things were going in this tournament for him. Anyway, they're playing against each other. This is going to be an extremely entertaining game. If you do want to see this video, just make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that. Give it a like. Let me know in the comments what do you think. And I will show you what's happening in this game. Hikaru goes for a 1e4. e6, the French defense. It's one of the favorite openings for those who are looking for a very complicated middle game. d4, d5, and now maybe a small surprise and something you don't often get to see at the highest level. The exchange variation, but nowadays this line is much more interesting than a lot of people will think. So don't click away, stay here and watch till the very end. Pawn takes d5. We have a symmetrical position, but as always in these symmetrical positions, white is always a little bit better. Has an extra move. Let's see how Nakamura is going to use that. Knight f3, bishop d6, and here he played the move c4. So that if you do take on c4, the bishop takes back with very active development. Here, black goes for the move knight f6. And we do get to see Hikaru's intentions now as he does advance the pawn to c5. Attacking the bishop, bishop goes back to e7. And interestingly, here we get to see a deviation from the game. Women's world champion Ju Wenjun played this earlier in the year against also against Firouzja in Wijk aan Zee, Tata Steel tournament. In that game, bishop d3 was played. I actually analyzed it on the ChessBase channel with Arnie, so you can look up that game over there. Instead, Hikaru had prepared this move queen a4. This looks absolutely bizarre. If you see this for the first time, this position, you would not expect this game to take place in the FIDE Candidates tournament. White is playing a lot of pawn moves, neglecting its development, then giving a random check, which can be met in various ways by black. But there are some idea behind it, because you're trying to disturb black's queenside development. I mean, there are different ways of playing, like c6 or knight d7. All these moves, they have some drawbacks as well. Bishop d7 played, counterattacking the queen. Queen goes back to c2. Black castles, and white gets the bishop out to e3, further supporting that pawn chain. And well, there are only a few games played with this system, and the leading expert on the white side of this system is Etienne Bacrot, famous French grandmaster. And actually, I used to play for 1 season in the 4NCL, the English Team Championship. And at some point, he also played this variation. And afterwards, he said that probably he's the only player in the world who plays the exchange variation against the French, trying to play for a win. I mean, a lot of players, they just want to get a boring game and they play a quick draw. But he believed that it's actually a very interesting way of trying to put some pressure on black. Now we see that also Hikaru is actually playing this line, and also various other top grandmasters. So it's not just a boring line at all, because in a few moves, the board is set on fire. Black play here the move knight c6. White goes for knight c3. And okay, black's position is a bit cramped. For instance, the queen on d8 is not able to move, so it takes a bit more time for black to connect the rooks. Black played the move b6 to challenge that pawn on c5. It's quite an annoying pawn. White is not interested in taking at all. It will help black to break free. So bishop e2, and in general, if you do take on c5, white does take back. Very soon a rook will come to the d file, and there will be pressure against the pawn on d5. Instead, Firouzja played knight b4, attacking the queen. Queen goes to d2, and now bishop f5, threatening knight c2 with a knight fork, winning material. Therefore, rook c1 is played, covering the c2 square. Black goes for knight g4, getting another knight into the game. I mean, you can ask yourself here, is knight takes e3 such a problem? Probably you can even allow it. What happens is also fascinating, as Hikaru just played bishop f4, moving the bishop away, not giving black the chance to trade off that knight for the bishop. But it's a pawn sacrifice. Pawn takes c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. Now there's another threat on f2. White is gonna castle, but why does White have compensation here for the pawn? Well, I think it has to do with the awkward placement of that knight on b4, which can always be kicked away with a3, but there's also pressure down the c-file indirectly against the bishop, as well as against the pawn on c7. If you do advance the pawn to d4, there is knight to b5, threatening to take something on c7 as well as c5. The bishop also got to be defending the knight on b4. So things are quite unpleasant, and I think the move played by Firouzja is much better. Rook e8, eyeing the bishop on e2. But White played here the move a3, questioning the knight. And now things are getting very serious. If you move the knight back to c6, it's knight b5, threatening a knight fork on c7, as well as there are two unprotected pieces on the c-file. Things are going wrong here for black. What should black do instead? The move played in the game is actually quite interesting, d4. We will get there in a second. The alternative is to sacrifice on f2. There's a long sequence to take with the rook on f2, and then you can even sacrifice on e2 as well. There is no need to take yet on f2. After knight takes e2, bishop takes, king takes, knight d3. That's why you want to eliminate the bishop on e2. It's another knight fork. Very complicated lines to calculate. You move your king away, for instance, and after knight takes c1, you take back with the queen. You have this very complicated material imbalance of two knights versus a rook and two pawns. But I do like White's coordination of its pieces. The king is pretty safe. The pieces are working well together. Pressure down the c-file. Nice blockading square. So it looks as if White is in good shape. Therefore, I guess that Firouzja didn't want to play it. Played instead the move d4, attacking the knight on c3. Don't take on b4. After pawn takes c3, queen takes, you can play bishop b6. Black is absolutely okay here. So White played the critical move, knight b5, moving the knight away. Still the knight on b4 is under threat. Knight takes c7 is also an idea, but Black is ignoring it by further advancing the pawn to d3. Now everything is hanging. This is so difficult to work out what to do. Should you just start capturing material or first remove the threat? Well, the machine does really like the move bishop d1. I think it's a very difficult move to work out. Both the knight as well as the bishop are hanging. Black should probably play knight a6 to defend the bishop and defend the pawn. This was all not played. Bishop d1 was not Hikaru's choice. One interesting line is that you can take on c7 here. So that if you do take, there is a rook takes c5 and both these two minor pieces are hanging. But it's not the end of the line. There is knight d5. And I imagine that this is something you see from afar and you think black is alright. Hits the bishop. Also, the bishop on f5 defends that annoying pawn on d3. So White will have to work hard to entangle. But apparently bishop c7 is a very difficult move to find. If you do take it, well, there is rook takes f5. And you have managed to trade off that very important bishop. It will become easier later to try to trade off that pawn on d3. Bishop b3, rook d1. These sort of moves, they come into consideration. White is clearly better here. But back to the game. Hikaru didn't play bishop d1. Went for rook takes c5. And now both this knight on b4 as well as the bishop on f5, they're both hanging. You cannot take with the rook on e2. Then it's queen takes b4 and White will be a piece up. So instead, there followed pawn takes e2, attacking the rook on f1. The rook goes to e1. So there's this passed pawn But here, the knight comes into d3. Material is still even, but still, everything is hanging. Knight is hitting the rook on c5, the rook on e1. And also the bishop on f5 can just be taken. And this is absolutely insane. This is the line Hikaru went for. And I wouldn't be surprised if he believed that he's just getting a much better position here. But apparently, according to the machine, there is one absolutely insane move which was definitely not seen by Firouzja as he didn't play it. And I dare to say that also Hikaru cannot have seen this in advance, because black can simply take the rook on e1. But queen d7 is just a much better move here, apparently, because you're attacking the rook. This rook looks pretty strange. Also, in some lines, the knight on b5 may be hanging. Okay, the knight is still defending it, but there are even plans to go rook a to d8. There are back rank issues for white as well. It's incredibly complex, but black is fine. Instead, Firouzja very quickly went here for knight takes e1. I think it's the human continuation. As here, you do take back with the knight. Everything still well protected. Queen takes d2, bishop takes d2. Once again, it's a position with two minor pieces, a bishop and a knight, for a rook. And black does have a passed pawn, but that passed pawn is nicely blockaded by the knight. First, rook a8, threatening to take the bishop on d2. The bishop goes to a square where it can count on the support of one of its pawns. Rook d1 looks incredibly unpleasant, but the bishop is still defending the knight, and therefore there are no problems. But white needs to think about how to entangle. f3 is played, attacking the knight on g4. The knight comes in to e3, attacking the rook on f5. But rather than moving the rook away, white just captured on c7. Beautiful idea, so that if you take on f5, it's knight takes e8. The knight will come back into the game. King f2 will be played soon as well. And everything seems to be okay here for white. So instead of taking the rook on f5, there followed rook e7. Now both the rook as well as the knight are hanging. So white's most logical move here is rook to c5, solving two problems in one move. Anyway, you're about to go king f2 to control, to support your knight on e1 even better. f6 is played to avoid any back rank issues, but the bishop comes into b4. The bishop still keeps the knight defended, and it's eyeing this rook on e7. The king comes to f7, and white is not in a rush. Everything is well covered. He just has even time here for a move like h4 to grab a bit more space. Black does the same. Players are getting lower on time, and Firouzja probably sets here a little trap. As well, it's not even, we cannot call it a trap. It's rook takes h5, taking a pawn. It's a poisoned pawn, as the knight on c7 can just be taken. So here, white instead decided now to play this move, king f2, getting closer with the king to the center. It's something you normally do in queenless middle games or end games, but probably this is a mistake. It was also not seen by Firouzja, but he can play this remarkable move, rook takes e1. Let me show you this line. If you do take with the king, you're just getting spinned around here by this knight. It's knight takes g2 with check. And if you go back with the king to f2, knight f4 is an incredible idea. With the knight coming in to d3. It is a knight fork, attacking the king and the rook. And well, something like rook c3 is not an option, because then the bishop is no longer covering the promotion square. So black is actually here in good shape. If you, instead of taking with the king, decide to take with the bishop, then the knight comes via the other side. It's knight d1 check. The king gotta go back. Knight takes b2, and once again the knight is coming to d3. And apparently black is doing sort of okay, because after rook c3, to prevent knight e3, the rook goes to d7, which is a great idea, guys. Knight d3 is being prepared. And then you're unable to maintain control over the promotion square, as the bishop will come under threat. Of course, you can always take with your rook the knight on d3. Once again, getting a position with a rook versus two minor pieces should be okay. I just want to mention also that king f2 is actually not possible because of knight d1. With a knight fork, you're getting totally crazy by this knight. If you take on e2, it's knight takes e3, bishop takes c3, rook takes c7, black is winning. So this is a way to generate counterplay for black. But instead, Firouzja didn't capture on e1, went for rook b1, and now the knight comes back to d5, offering the exchange of knights. And of course, that will give some clarity to both players, but especially white will be relieved when the knight on e3 is getting exchanged. So therefore, knight d1 check is played. The king goes to g3, and the rook is still under threat. So the rook goes to e5 to pin that knight. But the knight from e1 goes to d3. Beautiful idea. Attacking the rook on e5. Still, everything is under control by the bishop and the knight. The rook goes back to e8. And probably white is winning here. But it is incredibly complex. If you, for instance, play knight from d5 to f4, you're still controlling the pawn on e2. And if you take on b2, the main point is to give a check on c7, forcing the king to go back. Now you're blockading with your other knight. So everything is well covered. And on the next move, there will probably be knight takes h5 and taking on g7. And that means that white is probably going to win this. It's still very complicated position. But anyway, it was not played in the game. Bishop e1 was played. So the bishop goes back. But now the bishop is no longer active at all. Knight takes b2 is played, trying to deflect the knight. If you take it, it's rook takes e1, and black only needs to move that rook away, and then the e-pawn will be queen. Probably white can sacrifice the knight for the pawn, but then black will be in exchange up. So no knight takes b2. Instead, rook to b5 is played, so that if you take the knight, it's rook takes b1, white is a piece up and controls the bishop on e1. So that's not going to work, but look at this. After rook b5, there followed rook to d1 with a very nasty pin on the d file. Once again, if you take on b2, it's rook takes e1. Black is winning. Don't do that. White instead played rook takes b2. That is a safe move. After rook takes d3, the knight is under threat, but you give a check on b7. And that is okay. You can't go with your king to g6 because of knight f4. Forking. I mean, also white can give very nice knight forks. So the king goes back to f8, and this is a very clever idea because it looks as if the king is badly placed here. But you're hoping bishop b4 is going to be played with check. And after king g8, knight e7 for instance, but black can safely play king f7. Everything is fine. And one of the tricks is that you can't really set up a good discover check, first of all. That is the main thing. Of course, if knight goes away, also the rook will get back in charge of the e-pawn. And if you take on a7, then you have this deflection motive with e1 queen. If the bishop takes, well then the knight on e7 is captured. So king f8, tricky move, but Hikaru doesn't play bishop b4. He goes knight f4, attacking the rook. Rook takes the pawn on a3. And once again, bishop b4 is not leading anywhere because of king g8, and the rook can't be taken because of e1 queen. So no bishop b4, but instead king goes back to f2. And, well, how to evaluate this position? Black is now trying to push the pawn, and after rook a7, you may even push the pawn even further, but rook a4 was played, which is also fine, as you're attacking the pawn on h4. Maybe after knight takes h5, there's rook takes h4, and you gotta be careful, because even rook h1, rook f1 idea is on the agenda, but probably white is still okay. But is it enough to win? I don't know what's happening. In any case, Hikaru didn't capture the pawn. I mean, when you're trying to play for a win, you usually got to keep some pawns on the board. Therefore, he goes for g3, supporting the knight, supporting the pawn. And it's move 41. The players have just received 30 minutes extra. But Firouzja was, before, he was in time trouble. He was still continuing to blitz out this move. I'm actually not sure how much he spent on this move, but he played very fast. He could have spent much more time. And what he should do, well, probably a move like rook a1 does make a lot of sense. You cannot wrap up the pawn on e2 because of rook a2, and the knight will be pinned. So that is an issue. If you do take instead on h5, then rook b8 is a brilliant resource. Once again, the king can't capture on e2 because of rook e8, and the bishop is hanging. Here we see the strength of the rooks in general. They're looking for double attacks, pins, skewers, everything, trying to play against these pieces. Also, taking on a5 is not a possibility here, because after rook takes, bishop takes, it's rook b5, and both the minor pieces are hanging. Incredible tactics. Black is holding on here. I should also point out that bishop takes a5 is not an option because of e1 queen. And if you take the queen, it's rook takes a7. Fantastic rook play in this case. Black would probably have been able to save it, but Firouzja played g5, attacking the knight on f4. But after pawn takes, knight takes h5, white just wins the first pawn. And very soon, hopefully, the other pawns are going to follow as well. But Firouzja played here rook e5, and probably he was thinking that he is about to save the game. Because if you move the knight away, it's rook f5. Attacking the knight knight can go away, you move the king. There are all sorts of ideas, like rook a3 to hit the pawn, or maybe play g4 at some point. So black is going to save this. But instead, the key move, and this is not difficult to see for a player of Firouzja's status, he can just play here g4 white. I mean, saving the knight, and there's no pressure against the pawn on f3. King e8 was played, knight g7 check. Now the knight gets back into the game, making use of that pawn on g4, rook a2. Black is trying to defend here, but white has a very nice concrete solution to eliminate that pawn on a5. There follows rook a8 check. King gotta go to f7. Now it's knight d6 with another check. The king gotta move again. Then it's knight c4, another tempo move, hitting the rook. Rook gotta move. Then it's just rook takes a5. And you do force the exchange of rooks. After rook takes a5, knight takes a5. Finally, you've managed to get rid of that very annoying outside passed pawn. And, well, black played king d5. So it may seem as if the knight is almost stranded. But after king e3, there is nothing black can do here. Black even resigned, because the simple plan is that, for instance, after a rook move, you put a bishop on d2 to interfere on the second rank. You're about to wrap up that pawn on e2. Rook moves again, king takes e2. And then it's just a matter of time. You're not in a rush. The only thing you gotta do is step by step, activating your forces, ensuring that your knight comes back into the game. At some point, the pawn on g5 will just be taken, or you can move your knight first. You're consolidating. It's 2 versus 1. When you're winning the pawn on g5, you have 2 pawns and 2 minor pieces against the rook. It's completely hopeless. So that means Hikaru Nakamura wins his 3rd game in a row. And that also brings him back, or probably is the first time in a tournament, that he is actually in the shared lead. Because Jan Nepomniachtchi drew his game. Not an impressive game. By the way, he also played the French exchange variation. So this is a very hot opening at the moment. But Praggnanandhaa had an easy time against Jan Nepomniachtchi. So Jan never had a chance to win his game. Hikaru Nakamura back in the lead. The shared lead for sure with Jan Nepomniachtchi. And what is on the program, on the schedule in the next round? First we have a rest day. But after the rest day on Saturday, it is Jan Nepomniachtchi against Hikaru Nakamura. And that is going to be an epic fight, one for the books. You are going to see that game also on the channel. So make sure to come back anytime soon. Let me know what you think of Hikaru's game. And, well, looking forward to help the channel grow and work towards the final of the Candidates Tournament 2024.